So, very excited about this next talk from Wendy, Knox, Everette, who is noteworthy for a couple of reasons. One, she's a lawyer working at Leviathan Security, and it's always great to meet a lawyer at a security firm because they'll actually keep your stuff straight. Second, she's going to tackle something that is surprisingly relevant to a lot of us, which is SOC 2, right? This is the compliance model that we all need to do. So we all spend our days and nights thinking about security, but at the end of the day, someone has to show whether or not we're doing what we have to. And Wendy's going to dive into that security assurance. And third, and something that I'm the most proud of, is that Wendy, once upon a time, was my intern at NTIA, and she kind of broke the mold for all other following interns. She's just a bloody rock star. In fact, she's better than a rock star. She's a Willie Nelson. So I think you'll find this is going to be one of the more interesting compliance-oriented talks you'll ever see. So take it away, Wendy.
Hi, and welcome to our exploration of all things SOC 2 at BSidesLV 2021. So you might be saying, SOC what? I may have heard that term before, but I had no idea what it means. Well, you're in the right talk to learn some more. SOC 2 audits are designed to provide a way for organizations to demonstrate to customers that they have at least a minimal set of security controls and some oversight in place. Many companies that build software as a service or web-hosted software tools seek out a SOC 2 audit to provide a security maturity signal to their potential customers. And hi, I'm Wendy. I'm a senior security advisor at Leviathan Security Group. I work with startups to help build their security programs and grow their enterprise sales. As part of that, I often help them go through their first SOC 2 audits. So today, I'm going to share some of that knowledge with you. This talk is really designed as an introduction to SOC 2 audits. We're going to walk through what it would cover and discuss preparing for your first audit and how to make sure your company is set up for success. So what even are we talking about? There are several types of security program audits, like ISO 27001, FedRAMP, or HITRUST. Each of these, at a really high level, tries to check whether the audited company has functional security controls in place. Some of these, like FedRAMP, are required before the company can sell their software to a particular type of customer, like federal agencies in the case of FedRAMP. But some are voluntary, like SOC 2 and ISO audits usually are. But if it's voluntary, why would any company willingly undergo a security audit? Well, in this age of storing your sensitive information in systems that you haven't built and don't operate yourself, like using Salesforce or AWS or Jira, you want some way to ensure that these tools will protect your proprietary data. And in turn, if you're selling a tool that will hold sensitive data from your enterprise customers, they want assurances from you. The SOC 2 certification is one way that you can demonstrate that you're capable of protecting sensitive data. Understand, of course, that while audits can demonstrate a certain level of organizational maturity and require some evidence of some security safeguards, they don't really mean that a site is unhackable, and indeed, really nothing can. Let's pause here to note an important distinction between audits and assessments. Assessments can be thought of as more informal checkups, using a control set to generate a list of gaps for an organization. Audits are a little more formal and usually require the auditing firm to have a certain set of credentials. So for a SOC 2 audit, the auditing firm, for instance, must be a licensed CPA firm. Also, note that these audits do not cover technical security controls, such as protections against SQL injection or cross-site scripting. To check for those, you'll need to book a penetration test of your application. And so, let's jump on into discussing SOC 2 audits and how you can prepare for one. Every audit will check your program against a set of rules that we refer to as a control set. For a SOC 2 audit, your program will be checked against at least one of the 5 trust services criteria. Those are, as we see, security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Out of all these 5, only security is mandatory, and you can pick which other ones you might like to include. The security principle verifies that your information and systems are protected against unauthorized access. Auditors will look for processes to prevent or detect security issues, like breakdowns and circumventions of segregation of duty controls, detections of system failures, theft, or any other unauthorized access or removal of information. The availability principle, meanwhile, covers checks to ensure that information and systems are available for use. The SOC 2 availability principle doesn't actually mandate a particular SLA like 5.9's. Instead, it requires that you have monitoring and operating processes to support your defined SLAs. If you're running on a cloud platform like AWS, some of the implementation of this principle is just inherited from AWS's SOC 2. However, you do still need to set up monitoring and alerting for your VMs or processes that run within AWS, and you'll need to do some other things like disaster recovery testing. The confidentiality principle checks to see if the organization has a way to check information that is designated as sensitive. Can you limit its access to it? Can you limit the use and retention and restrict disclosure only to people authorized to view it? Again, if you're running on a cloud platform, a lot of the implementation of this principle can be inherited from that cloud platform's SOC 2 if they have one. Although you will still need some things like a data classification policy. And if your user laptops are in scope, you need to have an end-of-life procedure to protect the data on those disks. So those three principles, security, availability, and confidentiality, are the three most common ones included in any SOC 2 audit. But there are also two other ones you might want to include if they made sense for your platform. The processing integrity principle verifies your organization has controls to ensure completeness, accuracy, timeliness, and authorization of systems processing. It looks to see if you set up procedures and systems to ensure that information processing is free from error, delay, omission, and unauthorized or inadvertent manipulation. Meanwhile, privacy principle checks whether personal information, or PII as we usually refer to it, that is collected, used, and retained, is managed according to a few points that are very similar to other privacy regimes like the GDPR or CCPA. There are notice and consent verifications that check whether your organization tells users what information they collect and what they're going to do with it. The auditor also will check if your organization limits the use and retention of the PII, and if you have procedures to notify users in case of a data breach. Finally, as with most of these controls, the auditor will look to see if you have monitoring and enforcement of these controls. So you might have noticed that two of these, confidentiality and privacy, are really similar. They're actually two distinct concepts. Confidentiality checks to see if you protect data deemed sensitive by your organization, perhaps including things like your source code. Meanwhile, privacy looks at the controls around shielding PII from accidental disclosure or misuse. So, for each of these broad categories, we need to build a set of policies and procedures for your program that will implement the principles in each category, and which will be our control set that we are audited against. The controls that we build can be custom to our program, and so this is a way in which SOC 2 is a little bit different from a more prescriptive program like FedRAMP. So long as they fully implement all the relevant principles under each category that we are going to be audited against. So this sounds pretty generic and fuzzy, so let's jump on into some specifics. The trust services criteria are the foundation in most SOC 2 audits. Under each section, there are several COSO principles and callouts directing auditors for what to look for. You can find each of these in a PDF that's hosted online at this URL, and I will tweet out my slides later if you need to grab this. So let's take a look at one. Here's one under the security category. CC 1.3 tells us we need management to work with their independent oversight, which is usually the board of directors, to develop a security organization that has a charter and clear lines of reporting and responsibility. So note that some audit firms will give you a set of controls that they're used to working with that implement the TSPs. However, we found for smaller companies it's often better to create your own control wording that aligns with how you have implemented each of these TSPs. So for instance, if you use a federated identity management or CICD pipelines, let's make sure that the control wording reflects that. So let's take a look at two example controls that implement this principle. Here, we want to write a control for our control set that puts the idea of authorizing and defining a reporting structure into action. An org chart is one way that you can embody your organization's structure, and so first we'll write a control that we'll use an org chart to track who reports to who and who is in which department. Don't forget to account for any contractors, temp employees, or interns who work for you. And here we have a second control reflecting that. You also need to make sure that you have all of your policies created and approved by management. You will need an overarching information security policy that sets up your program and includes information about who your security officers are and what their charter is. Other policies should cover areas like access control and risk management that we'll look at very soon. So since SOC 2 audits need to collect evidence to show that you're following your controls, keep in mind that we need to create evidence artifacts that show that they are operating within our organization. We'll dig a little more into that shortly. So let's first have a look at a couple of the main areas that we will be responsible for implementing, in particular under the security and availability principles. Remember, you need to develop policies for each of these areas. Access control is a really big area for SOC 2 audits, like most security control implementations. And getting this right can make your other checks much easier. Of course, using a federated identity management system, like Okta, can simplify this a lot. It's actually not absolutely necessary. Here's one of our principles, CC 6.1. There are several COSO principles that touch on access control, but this is the one that usually most of the technical processes will fit under. In that PDF, there are several relevant points that tell the auditors what to check for when assessing your access controls. And here's an example control we would put in place to implement these checks within our organization. For all the systems in our audit scope, we want to have a control to capture how users authenticate into that system. We also want to address the least privilege access of CC 6.1. For using AWS, a control like this is a great way to capture this. Other things you need to set up procedures for and write controls to cover will be security basics like onboard, offboarding, user access control reviews. You'll want someone who owns each of those processes. For a startup, it might just be one person, but in a larger company, it will probably be several people. You also need to make sure you're implementing security awareness training and track who received the training and when. This really doesn't need to be anything fancy. You can build a simple training yourself to cover how to, say, securely use your email system, how to configure MFA, and teach users how to escalate potential security problems, and then track who you give the training to and when. Another critical area is change management, aka ensuring only modifications to software and systems that we expect to be implemented are implemented. Here's one of the principles that covers this area. It pretty much says that we verify and that we track modifications. So if you're using a rigid waterfall development flow, it can be pretty obvious how to implement this, and many times the control sets the auditors come with assume that you're using a formal SDLC in a waterfall flow. However, you can also meet this principle in agile environments that deploy hundreds of times per day using automated testing and CICD pipelines. Note that these are some of the points the auditor will look for, and we can do each one of these in that agile cloud environment. So for example, here are two controls showing how we can meet this principle without that formal waterfall SDLC. Note how we capture some of the points the auditors look for, documenting and testing changes in a way that shows how our cloud-based system handles them. Another area that we need to cover is patching and updates. We'll need a policy stating what our patching timeline is. So for example, critical fixes may be fixed within 24 hours, less critical ones that we rate medium within a week, and we will need to retain logs to show what our security patches that we've installed on in-scope systems. We also need to perform regular security testing, such as getting an annual penetration test, and then show that we've remediated any issues found during that test. One area where a lot of smaller companies are unsure how to begin is risk management. You want to make sure you think about and write down all the risks to your business, especially any areas that are vulnerable to fraud. You will document each risk and its severity, impact, and likelihood rating, such as low, medium, and high, into a risk register. which you can store in a tool like Jira or a spreadsheet. You can certainly use very complicated custom risk management tools, but spreadsheets are also fine for your first few years in a SOC 2. You definitely want to make sure you document an annual review of each risk, as well as compensating controls that you've implemented. A SOC 2 auditor will definitely want to make sure that you have a way to be notified of system outages or security incidents. For this area, you might want to show how you use guard duty, capture screenshots of availability alerting you've configured, do a screen share walkthrough of your SIM or your other security tools, and to show post-mortem write-ups of past availability or security incidents, particularly if you can tie them to patches that you have made to correct the root causes. Being able to track improvements you've made as a result of these post-mortem reviews will definitely help show that you have a mature program in place. So once we've implemented various policies and processes to meet all these sections of the security section, how do we ensure that the processes are being followed within our company? A SOC 2 auditor will ensure that you've verified everything is running smoothly. There are a couple different ways to do this. Some of the nice ones involve the use of automated tooling, like turning on branch protection in GitHub to ensure that code reviews are being done. Your team will also want to meet regularly to perform some checks to ensure policies are being followed. Were all access control reviews finished last quarter? Do all production systems still have appropriate monitoring implemented and alerting the right teams? If you do these checks monthly or on some other regular cadence, you should then write up short minutes documenting what you verified and any corrections you put in place. Congrats, you now have a lightweight internal audit process. Here's one example that we've set up that breaks down various internal task checks by month, but you can use any schedule that works for your company. Note here that for each section, including access control review and workstation controls here, we have both the security controls that security or IT or developers should be doing, and our second meta level of internal audit review that we will be doing in order to verify our controls are correctly being followed. So, now we've reviewed a couple of the areas that SOC 2 audits generally cover. We want to look at how we would show that our organization is implementing and following all of these controls throughout our period. These are two controls we discussed earlier to implement CC 1.3 in our organization. But how would we prove to an auditor that we're following these? Here are two possible types of evidence we could use for this control. Good evidence is generated by a system your employees use all the time, not something you need to remember to backfill. So something like Gusto, which you may be using to manage payroll or benefits, is a great tool to lean on for evidence generation. It should already be up to date and give us accurate evidence. And also, here are two types of tools we could use to show that contractors have defined managers within an organization. And remember, as you gather this evidence, you can redact sensitive information like salary information and a screenshot of a payroll system. What about these other controls? For these, we would likely be taking screenshots of the CICD pipeline or the security group configuration files. Auditors need to authenticate the evidence that you provide, and so they may ask that you do a screen share or project in a conference room as you log into the system to run the tools and take these screenshots or capture these logs. So, you may have heard that there are two types of SOC 2 audits, a SOC 2 Type 1 and a SOC 2 Type 2. When you go to have your SOC 2 audit performed, you'll have to choose which one you want done. Both the Type 1 and the Type 2 look at the same principles, and you would use the same control set for both. The difference is what sort of evidence you would provide and the time period the audit looks at. A SOC 2 Type 1 is a little more of a proof of concept audit. It checks to see if your controls, if implemented correctly, would fulfill the principles you're being audited against. If you've never done a SOC 2 audit before, it's a very good idea to start with a Type 1. During the Type 1, the auditor will look at your policy documentation and will often ask to see screenshots and other evidence of the implementation of your controls. But for each control, you need only show that it was exercised once. So for example, for your HR onboarding controls, you may be able to pick a recent employee and show that this chosen employee signed an NDA and received security awareness training, and show their onboarding checklist. For a Type 2, you will need to show that all of your controls operated over everything over the entire period of the audit. Populations are requests from your auditor for all the people who work in your company, or perhaps all the JIRA tickets for code that was deployed to your production system, full lists of your releases or your versions from GitHub, or perhaps all the endpoints in your inventory or all the subscriptions in your cloud. Each one of these lists will be then used to request specific pieces of evidence to show control operation. If you are doing a Type 1 audit, this is a little bit less important. An auditor might ask for a list of your employees in a Type 1 just to ensure you're tracking the information and could generate it, but they likely won't select particular items from that list to ask for evidence about. However, in a Type 2, an auditor will want to authenticate your population polls, which might be done with screen sharing, and then we move on to sampling. So if you're doing a Type 2 audit, the auditor will want to make sure that your controls always operated during the test period. They do this with sampling. The auditor will randomly select a subset of items from your populations and ask you to provide evidence that your control operated on those samples. So for example, they may ask for the full list of all your employees hired during the test period, such as over the last 6 months or over the last year. From that, they may select a set of employees and ask you to provide the signed NDAs, the onboarding checklists, evidence that a permission group owner granted permission for each permission type they have, such as access to an AWS environment or GitHub permissions. You would do that for every employee selected in that sample. So, as you build your controls and procedures, think about how you would retain artifacts that show that the procedure was followed. Also, think about retention. If you have a control that says that you run automated tests on every production release, make sure that you retain logs from all the test runs during that test period. If your test period is 1 year long, but you only keep 2 weeks of test run logs, you have no way to prove to the auditor that the test ran for the other 50 weeks, and this can lead to a control failure. So, the best types of evidence are those that are created by the system used to do the action, and which require users to have logged in or otherwise authenticated themselves to it so that you know who did the action. Ideally, also with a timestamp. With our automated test control, your CICD pipeline should automatically create a test log. It's great, just make sure that they're being retained on a disk somewhere. If you have a control that says that you do access control reviews, try to use a tool that logs that the review happened. So for example, you could build a tool that generates newly populated Google spreadsheet with all the members of each AWS security group, and email that to the group owners each quarter. They could then add a note to the spreadsheet about whether the members should still have access or whether they removed them. Now you have authenticated evidence in that Google Sheet with timestamps showing that the access control reviews happened. Audit Scope, by the way, is something we referred to a few times here. It is a definition of what systems are actually reviewed in the audit. For a SOC 2 report, the auditor will help you with a system description that goes into the beginning of your audit report, in which describes the scope of the systems covered. Do you want to restrict your SOC 2 to just your AWS or GCP environment? Are user laptops in scope as well? Your auditor will probably have input on that, but you should think ahead of time about the advantages and disadvantages of various scopes. So, we've talked a lot about what audit firms will look for during your SOC 2 audit. Let's also chat a little bit about how you can select a firm to do your audit. This can be a really big, scary choice if you want a reputable firm who you can work well with. If you've built your control set to match your company's security program and how you operate as a company, then you might want to find a firm that can audit you against your own control set. Some firms will be able to check that your control set fully implements TSPs, and they may then have slight adjustments to ensure that you're correctly implementing the TSPs. Often, they will add supplementary controls at this point, or they may point out that you have duplicate controls that can be merged together. But some firms may only be able to audit you against their standard set of controls. These controls could be overly cumbersome for smaller or agile shops. You should have a very frank discussion with the audit firm about what control set they will use and what evidence they will expect you to provide for each of these. Discuss with them how much flexibility there might be in their control set and any gaps that they see in any controls that you bring to the table. Similarly, each firm will collect evidence in a different way. It's a very good idea to ask to see a screen share of how this tool works for the firm, as you're going to spend a lot of time interfacing with it. Is it clear to you how you will tie uploaded evidence to a particular control? Definitely make sure you discuss how they handle situations where one piece of evidence addresses many controls. How do they let you know if a piece of evidence is inadequate and you need to provide a different screenshot or log? Finally, can you easily communicate status through the platform? Do you know when they have done an initial sign-off on a control, or when they need more information or more screenshots or better screenshots with timestamps in them from you? Post-pandemic, a lot of audits have shifted from a few people squeezed into a conference room for a week to more virtual events. Perhaps some kickoff video conferencing and screen sharing walkthroughs, but otherwise a little bit more asynchronous rounds of evidence collection and review facilitated by the audit firm's evidence collection tooling. You will want to ensure that the firm understands what your application does during the kickoff and schedule time for walkthroughs of things like monitoring and alerting systems, including appropriate technical subject matters, so that the auditors can see how you have implemented your controls. Also note that you'll need a way to track your status internally. I'm a big fan of syncing every evidence request into the company's JIRA and then tracking evidence within there, uploading as attachments, and closing the JIRA ticket when we believe that the control has been satisfied. But note that you should use your own system, whatever works with how you usually work. At the end of the audit, you'll receive a report with your audit result. With luck, this will be an unqualified opinion and state that the firm was able to verify that all of your controls operated across all of the samples that they checked throughout the entire period. It is possible, however, that the report will note that some controls did not operate. In a tiny startup, for instance, it's possible to have a note say that, for example, offboarding controls did not operate, and that might simply be because no one left the company during the audit period. This sort of control did not operate is fine. You don't want too many of them, but people will understand that, especially at a small company, people may not join or leave the company, and people may not switch roles. However, if you are not able to provide evidence of a particular control operating for the full period, you may receive an exception on that control. For example, if we have that CICD pipeline that only retains 2 weeks worth of logs, and we had a year-long audit period, you may find that the audit firm has put an exception in the report explaining they could not verify that all releases during the year were verified by automated tests before being released to production. If you don't have the logs anymore, the audit firm cannot just take your word for it. So qualified, disclaimer, or adverse opinions mean that the audit firm is not able to verify that your controls operated during the test period, and essentially are failing opinions. In the case of SOC 2 Type 1, it is highly unlikely you would get one of these. The audit firm will instead work with you on implementing each of the control set until you have a full control set that is adequate to fulfill the TSPs. However, in a SOC 2 Type 2 with a defined time period, you must be able to show to the audit firm that every control operated across every item in your environment throughout the entire period. If you receive a qualified disclaimer or adverse opinion, you need to work with the audit firm to understand what caused the failure and how best to correct the gaps for your next audit. So, after your first successful Type 1 audit, you'll want to roll into a test period that would conclude with your first Type 2 audit. And after each Type 2 audit, you should begin another test period to end with your next annual Type 2 audit. At the end of each audit, however, you should sit down with everyone involved in your program and discuss what went well and where you can improve your processes. It's possible that your auditor may provide suggestions for better ways to generate evidence or improvements in your procedures. Flagging opportunities for automation or fine-tuning your processes will make each next audit cycle go much easier. At the same time, an audit firm will often expect to see some growth and maturity of your processes. You may receive recommendations from the audit firm about tweaks you can make in areas for growth. You want to take these under consideration, particularly areas like risk management, where you can show that you have a more sophisticated understanding of the risks facing your business and better ways to implement compensating controls and to address them year after year. And so, we've now covered the basics of a SOC 2 audit. Hopefully this information has set your security program up for a successful SOC 2 prep and audit. I'm happy to answer questions in our Q&A period or come by our Discord. Please tweet me at WendyCK, and I will have these slides up so that you can grab things like the URL to the trust services criteria later. Thank you.
All right, dive in.
I have the Discord up, and so if you guys are not hearing me, please yell loudly in Discord. I was saying that the question about can a company use the controls to define the scope of the SOC 2 report is a great question. One of the first things that we like to talk about with people is whether you want to restrict your scope just to your cloud environment, or whether you're also going to include your user laptops and your office and so forth. And so obviously, if you start bringing in physical security controls, that does change the scope of it. If you're restricted to the cloud environment, the physical security controls are basically all inherited from AWS or from GCP, wherever you guys are running. As soon as we start talking about cameras and so forth in the office, that becomes in scope. And one of the things I like to tell people is, sure, we could restrict it just to your cloud environment, but if you have confidential customer information on your user laptops, or if people are doing things on the mobile devices, those need to be in scope, because really people are concerned about getting your SOC 2 report and finding out, are you going to protect my information? And so if we have a ton of customer data on user laptops, but it's not in scope, then that can be an issue. And that actually is something, if I see a report from a company that is just restricted to the cloud environment, I'm going to look for a data classification set of controls that says that you can't put customer data on user laptops. And if not, I'm going to follow up with them with questions. So yes, that is sort of one way that you can use controls to define the scope of your report. And that's one of the questions you should address with your audit team. You know, this is what we'd like the scope to be, and so let's make sure that the controls meet it. I want to say there was also a question that went by about
hang on, before we dive in, because there's Decaf has a fun point, which is saying, hey, does that mean that we should think about scope as following where the data goes?
Yeah, if you're beating the spirit of the SOC 2, which I'm going to understand. I hate to say this, but people play compliance games very much, and people play scope games a lot. If they're following this correctly, then yes. You should think in terms of anything that has the customer confidential data, which is what we care about protecting for most of the SOC 2 reports when we're talking about a cloud SaaS, that yes, there should be controls that cover everything in there. And they should have a very strong data classification policy that says, you know, customer PII is this particular level, some of our IP is this other less sensitive level, you know, and there are controls that address where each one of them can go, and controls that say how you secure the data on each of those places.
I like that. Jim chimes in that says data mapping is now actually one of those controls.
Yeah. Yeah, you pretty much are going to have a very hard time trying to do a SOC 2 without a data classification thing, providing architecture diagrams and so forth to the audit team. They will want to see how that flow goes.
The answer just can't be, it goes everywhere.
You're going to have an extremely difficult time doing a SOC 2 with a reputable audit firm with that kind of answer. Yeah.
And so, Wendy, that actually gets to one of the questions that someone raised earlier, which is, hey, what do I look for when I'm sort of poking around to say this? And I guess there are two ways, right? Let's answer the, if I want to actually show I'm secure, and then maybe you could give us the venal bad answer, which is, what do I look for if I just want to pass?
If you just want to pass, oh man, so let's answer the correct one first. You should talk to the auditors when you're interviewing them and make sure, since we're talking about cloud SaaSes and so forth, that they even understand what AWS is and what GCP is. There's a lot of auditors that have been out there who are much more used to data centers, sort of the 90s architecture and so forth. And they're probably great auditors, but for that sort of environment. And so we want to make sure they understand our technology. And looking around on the audit firm's website, do their auditors have certifications? And of course, certifications do not mean everything, but they can be a little bit of a ground floor. Looking to see if the auditor's gone and published, talks or written blog posts or stuff that sound credible. And also, if you're doing vendor security reviews for companies, a lot of times you are seeing a lot of SOC 2s come in. And I sometimes make note of like, hey, the intro to the SOC 2 report sounds pretty good. The notes in the controls here sound like the auditor understands what's going on. I'm like, okay, this audit firm probably has at least a little bit of a clue on it. And so you sort of get used to audit firms that, are pretty good in the cloud area. If you just want to scrape by and pass, you want auditors where basically, I hate to say this, but if an auditor doesn't understand the technology, it's sometimes easier to push over things to, it's happening behind the magic screen here. Don't dig in too deeply.
Go for the ones where if you say, we use blockchain, they'll be like, oh, that's good.
Yeah. I hate to say it, but I've had arguments with auditors about why I don't have AV in my Lambdas. And I'm like, let me sit down and attempt to explain to you why it's super unlikely to have malware sitting in my Lambdas and talk about why that's a really dumb thing to be asking me. Like, let's level set and what's going on here. And that's happened with auditors who are pretty up on AWS, but maybe not on all of the newest stuff. Yeah.
Fun. Is there a question that you had in mind, or we can pull from?
There was the one that was asked a little bit ago about, is there a typical set of controls available for a small startup, or do you have to start with the controls provided by the auditor and then customize from there? A lot of times, if you don't have any controls at all, the auditor should be able to come in and give you a fairly good set of controls. Some of them are more flexible than others about how much modification they will allow. Some of them, a lot of times, due to the nature of how they run their audits and how they collect their evidence, really struggle to change the control set. And my advice is, if you're a small startup that runs on AWS, unless that is a really good control set for that, you may want to stay away from working with them, just because it's going to be a lot of struggle for you as a company that's new to SOC 2. But yeah, so I really don't want to come in and be like, well, I'm a consultant and I can do this. I have a set of controls that I often start with a company, but then I interview them and talk about like, okay, how are you actually doing this? And so you can also do the same thing. You can sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to look at the trust services criteria that says that I need to secure access to customer data. How are we doing this? How are we gaining access into AWS? Well, let's write a control to say what we do. And you don't need to worry about perfectly refining that control. That is something the auditor can work with you. If you say, we use multi-factor and you need to assume a security role within AWS, or we use multi-factor in GCP, the auditor can help you sort of clean that up to be the appropriate language for it. And one of the things that people sometimes get stumped about with SOC 2 when they start it is that there's essentially a many-to-many relationship. One control can fulfill many trust services principles. And also, you have many controls that fulfill a single trust services principle. So it's not like you need to write one mega control to meet a trust services principle. You're going to be fulfilling different aspects of different controls. And so that many-to-many can be a little weird when you start out. But that is essentially how we work with folks to meet it. We're basically trying to capture what their processes actually are And obviously, if there's gaps in those processes, if we say, like, hey, you have all these really great controls for AWS, but you also allow people to put data on your endpoints. And so we need to talk about your laptop controls. Let's talk about how you're ensuring that people are updating the software on there and requiring file vault or BitLocker and so forth. And an auditor can do the same thing. They can catch those gaps and work with you to address them. Yeah.
I like that. Cool. Are there other questions you're excited about?
Yeah, Jim has got a great one.
Yes.
I really like Jim's about using GRC platforms to manage SOC 2 and compliance frameworks. I got to be honest, I use Jira extensively. There's a Jira plugin called Recurring Tasks that you can buy in the Jira Marketplace, and it allows you to set up templates, and it will fire as often as you tell them. So I run access control reviews through that. I run a lot of internal audit through that. Like we have an annual one that will fire to go schedule our pen test, and an annual one a few months later to make sure that we have tracked things that came out of the pen test and we're addressing them. And then also Google Sheets. I don't use a lot of custom GRC software, mostly because I work with startups that are already usually paying for Google Docs, and I don't want to be like, oh, you need to go buy this $30,000 tool. I do risk registers and Google Sheets most of the time, or within Jira. And those tools can be flexed, especially things like the Jira Recurring Task plugin, in order to meet most of the needs for a small company doing SOC 2. Obviously, if you're a really big, huge enterprise and you're also doing FedRAMP and so forth, you're in a whole nother level of maturity, and you probably already have GRC platforms in place, which would then make sense to do that. Yeah.
Cool. So you talked about sort of automation and how that could scale. Are there things that you see, or there new tools coming on the marketplace, or even maybe open source, that you think are really exciting?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. Dependabot has made our lives so much easier on the vulnerability managing thing. If we set up branch protection within GitHub and we set up Dependabot and whatever, those two things alone can get rid of a lot of problems that we've had in the past, and making sure that all the changes that get merged in have been reviewed, and making sure that we're on top of getting patches fixed. So those are kind of automation. The Jira Recurring Tasks is one of my favorite things. I've seen people do stuff with, scripting against the Okta API and so forth. Some of that, usually I will provide advice on, like, hey, I see us struggling in the SOC 2 every year for this particular thing. Like, do you have SREs or other folks who are able to go in and do it? As a consultant, I often don't end up writing it myself for them, but definitely doing code reviews on things and so forth to make sure that whatever we put in place is not too brittle.
Fun. And yeah, and I like your approach to say, hey, it's often Google Docs is going to help us as well.
Yeah. Flagging your gaps with different conditional formatting and things, just those very simple things will go a very long way to help you sort of see at a glance what your status is for these. And for me, that's really important, because a lot of times I'm running 3 or 4 different SOC 2 audits at the same time. And so there's a lot to sort of track through there.
So let's see. There's a question about how do you get your auditors comfortable with CICD? If you're looking for, if your auditors are a little more classic, big industry, how do you sort of help them understand that?
They want to see that. A lot of times it's getting the SREs or other engineers in there who have written the tests, and we talk about, here's what the gates are. We don't deploy until certain tests go. Some folks still are using CICD, but they hold things at, maybe a 5% deploy to a canary, and then require someone just to use a Slack bot or something to approve it to go beyond that. And so if you have auditors who are really uncomfortable with things, you can do that sort of last gate to push things out. But yeah, they're usually, once we talk through, like, here's the checks that we're doing, and it's not just, a bunch of really stupid print out within a test, it works.
I remember there was a recruiting ad for a giant tech company maybe 10 years ago, and it was someone saying, I've only been here 3 weeks, I'm already pushing code. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good thing.
It is a good thing, though. That means that you have really strong unit tests, and you have a really mature framework, and you're rolling out to Canary and making sure errors aren't spiking, and then approving your release to go out further. Yeah, so that's a very mature sign.
I love it. That's fantastic. So we only have a few more minutes, and Wendy, I wanted if you could speculate. This isn't necessarily a happy word, but as you look towards the future of this kind of compliance regime, what are some of the things that you think maybe aren't going to be in the certification today, but you have a hunch we're going to need to think about in the future?
Let's see, I have not yet had any auditors ask me about SBOM, and I think that that's clearly something that's kind of important coming up. Yes. Yeah, I mean, and I would really love to see auditors just getting more comfortable with understanding what security groups are and working with the tools that Azure and so forth make available. AWS and Azure have a ton of really great compliance tools available, and so be making it easier for those to connect directly to Audit Firm evidence collection things, so I don't have to do the manual syncing between them.
Excellent. Well, Wendy, one of the things I'm always blown away by all your presentations, you take things that are sort of dry and obscure and legal and make them not only accessible, but really interesting. So thank you so much for doing that. Again, you're just going to have to work to find more boring topics to get us all really excited about, because I know a lot of us are now more excited about SOC 2.
Cool. Thank you so much, everybody.